Some people ask me, Patrick, you wrote a book called Things Atheists Say That Simply Make No Sense. Um, but since only 3 or 4% of people in America are actually atheists, what's the big deal? And roughly 90% of people in the United States believe in God. So why do you need to write a book like this? And the way that I respond to that is really threefold. The first reason that I think is really incredibly compelling is that though they make up 3 or 4% of the US population, these are incredibly loud voices. So from the early 2000s to today, there's been an absolute deluge of books by atheist authors. Here's just a quick sampling. The End of Faith by Sam Harris, Affirmations, Paul Kirk, Atheism and Philosophy, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, Breaking the Spell, The Portable Atheist, God is Not Great, God, the Failed Hypothesis, Letter to a Christian Nation, the New Atheism, Good Without God, On Being, Atheist Guide to Reality, Fighting God, Outgrowing God. Yeah, the list is just incredibly long. And the thing that is really, I guess, doubly of concern to me is it's not just the deluge of books. It's that these voices are incredibly well positioned. Many of them are college professors. So here's an example. A book was recently written called The Bad Jesus. Sounds like an interesting title, but it's really interesting in that the author was an Iowa State University religion professor named Hector Avalos. And these are just some of his chapter headings, just as an example. Chapter 2, the unloving Jesus. Chapter 3, the hateful Jesus. 4, the violent Jesus. Chapter 5, the suicidal Jesus. Chapter 6, the imperialist Jesus. And the list goes on. The anti-Jewish Jesus. The uneconomic Jesus as enemy of the poor. The anti-disabled Jesus. The eco-hostile Jesus. And this gentleman is a university professor teaching religion. So you kind of ask, well, why, if you are opposed to religion, which he is, why would you be a religion professor? Well, the only conclusion I can reach is it's certainly to not advance religion. And these are the kind of voices that have a very, very prominent position. And Hector Avalos isn't alone. When you look at the list of books that I just read, there's a huge list of these people that are university professors. Richard Dawkins, for example, was a professor at Oxford. His book, The God Delusion, has sold over 3.3 million copies. This is a big deal. They're loud voices, they're well-positioned voices, and sadly, it seems that some of these voices are actually having an effect. And the way that we see that is, I call it the erosion of confidence. The Gallup poll organization did a survey in 2005 asking people what their confidence level was that God exists. And in 2005, 79% of people in America surveyed were confident that God exists. But then when you roll the clock forward only 12 years, the number dropped from 79% to 64%. A 1%, a little over 1% drop per year. And this is during this time frame where all of these very prominent, very well-positioned atheists are speaking very, very boldly and very, very loudly. So my concern is that these voices are actually having an effect on society. That should give the church a little bit of concern. So the next question is, well, if this is such a big deal, what are churches actually doing about it? And sadly, a lot of churches don't really know how to respond to it. They just don't have the ability, they don't have the skill, they don't have the background. But if some that do, they're building into their curriculum, they're trying to build it into the sermons, they're building it into their Sunday school programs. So they are trying to respond. So if you ask me, what would a good response potentially look like? Here's a few examples. So if a Sunday school teacher or pastor is teaching about Jesus, going through the Gospels, obviously this is always the starting point. You want to add and build in the historical evidence for Jesus. So that you're not just talking about Jesus from the Gospels, but you're giving them external evidence that supports that Jesus was a real person, that there's external historical sources that support the gospel accounts. This kind of stuff is really important. When you're teaching through the book of Genesis, you need to bring in science. You know, this is an area that's, I guess, creating probably one of the biggest questions, especially in high school and college students' minds, is how does Christianity relate to scientific evidence? Well, you need to speak into that question. And another couple of things that have, I guess, caused me to ponder a bit is, you know, if you were to personally respond as a parent, how do you do that? Well, obviously, as a parent, you want to, you know, be incredibly loving and kind to your children. That gains your credibility and respect as a parent, okay? You want to teach your children from the Bible. You want to share truth with your children. But what you also want to do is you don't want to be intimidated by all of these atheist and non-believers' claims. Don't be put off by the bold, brash voices. That's, you know, kind of the starting point. You also need to know what your kids are reading, because you need to know what you need to respond to, and then start exposing them to some ideas. And here's a couple of examples. A few years back, there's a simple movie called God's Not Dead. Okay, simple little video. It's actually very impactful, about a college student who goes off and is dealing with an atheist professor. This is the kind of stuff that if you just bring it into your home, you start exposing your kids to these ideas. So how do you equip yourself? Another good resource that I would suggest is a nice little book. It's called God's Planet. It's actually written by Owen Gingerich, who's a Harvard astronomy professor. Gentleman's a Christian. And obviously at Harvard, his beliefs are challenged with a great deal of passion and emotion, I assume. And he was able to stand up very well against that. And he gives you a lot of very simple ideas about why he believes, as a scientist, that the universe is incredibly congenial to life, and that a reasonable conclusion is that a creator God is responsible for all of this. The other thing I would suggest is, if your church doesn't have the capability to respond, either because you don't have people who have this specific area of expertise, invite someone. There's a lot of great organizations, Reason to Believe, the Discovery Institute. Call them. They're willing to come. They'll perform a seminar for you. They're experts at this. This is what they do for a living. And I guess a final question that a lot of people ask me is, how did I personally get involved in all this? This wasn't what I was expecting to do for the last 4 or 5 years. And the way that I respond to that is, when your high school kids are coming home and conveying to you that their friends are proclaiming that there is no such thing as morality because God doesn't exist, and when their friends are inviting them to seminars advancing atheism, and this is happening to your high school children, you sort of have a couple of options. The first option is ignore it. Probably not very smart. Second option is to get angry. That's not necessarily a great option either. The third option, which is the one that I chose, was to engage with the ideas and explain to my kids how these ideas make absolutely no sense, that the evidence for God is overwhelmingly compelling if you just take the time to look at it. And I guess what I would do at this point is, for those of you who are watching, invite you to do the same. Your kids have questions. Your coworkers have questions. You know, your extended family have questions. And it would be really, really great if you had the capability to respond. So I invite you to take the time and to join me on this journey. God is not intimidated by questions, and you shouldn't be either. And